Richard Westbrook, a successful CEO, had it all: money, power, status. But there was one thing he never expected to find: a secret from his past that would change everything. It all started with a simple offer to a homeless woman to be his date at a high society Christmas party. And the shocking twist that followed will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another jaw-dropping twist. Now let's begin. Richard Westbrook, the 45-year-old CEO of one of the country's top investment firms, stood at his mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on the sleek, modern clock on the wall. The rhythmic ticking of the second hand filled the otherwise silent room. Outside the panoramic windows of his penthouse office, the city below sparkled with life. The streets were alive with festive lights, children laughing as they rushed home from school, and the faint sound of carolers singing Christmas classics in the distance. It was, to anyone else, the epitome of the holiday spirit. But to Richard, it was all a distraction. His perfectly manicured world had no place for the kind of sentimentality that came with Christmas. He leaned back in his leather chair, eyes narrowing as he watched the glittering lights reflect off the glass buildings below. The thought of Christmas filled him with disdain. The season, so beloved by the masses, was a nuisance. A time when productivity slowed, when people traded efficiency for sentimentality. The ringing phones, the buzzing emails, the constant stream of stock reports. They all seemed to grind to a halt as the holiday season arrived. People indulged in meaningless traditions, throwing office parties and exchanging half-hearted gifts, all the while pretending to care about things they didn't really understand. Wasting time, Richard muttered under his breath, adjusting his tie as he stared at his computer screen. The numbers on the spreadsheet blurred before him. He had work to do. Plenty of it. No time for Christmas. He'd always found the season to be an inconvenience, and this year was no different. His employees, too, seemed to be caught up in the festivities, their productivity faltering with every passing day. His thoughts drifted briefly to the annual Christmas party the company hosted, a charade of champagne toasts and forced cheer. He would attend, of course, but only because it was expected of him. He had long since stopped finding any joy in these events. He preferred the quiet hum of his office, the comforting rhythm of hard work. That's where Richard Westbrook thrived, detached from the noise and the clutter of people's emotions. With a sigh, Richard glanced at the clock once more. It was nearly 5 o'clock, too late for him to leave the office just yet. He needed to finish the final draft of the report, meet with a few clients, and prepare for the upcoming board meeting. But as the minutes ticked on, a growing sense of unease gnawed at him. Despite his best efforts, the festive air outside seemed to seep into his consciousness. The Christmas music drifting up from the streets below. The sight of families bundled in scarves and mittens, eager to celebrate. The thought of people enjoying simple pleasures, something Richard had long since abandoned, began to annoy him. He wasn't like them, and he didn't want to be. But still, a part of him wondered if something was missing. Something in the world he had built for himself, a world of wealth, status, and control. He had everything anyone could want, and yet there was a hollow feeling that he couldn't shake. Christmas, with its promises of warmth and connection, had always felt like a far-off dream to him. The image of families gathered around hearths, friends exchanging thoughtful gifts, or people simply sharing a meal, it all seemed foreign. His life, controlled and precise, didn't leave room for such things. As the clock struck 5, Richard stood abruptly, forcing himself to focus. There was no time for contemplation. The world would keep turning, whether or not he engaged with its distractions. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair, ready to head home. Christmas would come and go, just like every other year, and he would remain unaffected, continuing his work, just as he always did. There was no place for Christmas in his life. Not now. Not ever. Yet, despite his resolve, a strange sensation lingered in the pit of his stomach as he walked out of his office and into the elevator. The city below pulsed with life, the holiday season moving forward with or without him. Richard couldn't help but feel as if something was passing him by. Richard's penthouse was a mere 15 minutes walk from his office, but the city streets were far from the quiet, empty lanes he preferred. Even after hours, the holiday energy had a life of its own, buzzing through the streets with the intensity of 1,000 conversations, laughter, and clinking glasses. As Richard walked, his polished leather shoes clicked against the sidewalk, a sharp contrast to the soft, almost melodic hum of the crowds around him. The festive lights above twinkled in the darkness, the glow of Christmas trees in store windows casting long shadows over the cobblestones. The scent of roasted chestnuts caught his attention first. He'd been so absorbed in his thoughts that he hadn't noticed the small street vendor at the corner. A food cart, its weathered metal frame painted a dull shade of red, sat beneath a string of fairy lights. An old-fashioned brass bell on the cart jingled as a man turned the handle of the roasting machine, filling the air with the intoxicating aroma of the sweet nuts. It was a sharp reminder of how the city embraced the holidays. Everything was designed to evoke nostalgia, to summon memories of childhood joys and family gatherings. Yet, none of it stirred Richard. He had never been one for these sentimental reminders of the past. But as he walked past the cart, something strange happened. A voice called out to him, and he froze in his tracks. "Excuse me, sir. Would you like some free coffee?" Richard turned to see the source of the voice. Standing behind the cart was a woman, her face half hidden beneath the layers of mismatched clothing she wore. She was thin, too thin, with cheeks hollowed by hunger and weathered by time, her skin roughened by the elements. Yet despite the ragged appearance, there was a warmth to her. Her eyes were bright, and a gentle smile tugged at her lips as she offered him a paper cup. Richard raised an eyebrow, his instinct to refuse already forming in his mind. Free coffee? From a street vendor? It seemed absurd. But as his gaze shifted from her eyes to the coffee cup she held out to him, something compelled him to pause. Perhaps it was the sheer simplicity of the offer, the humbling humility in her demeanor. Or maybe it was just the odd, undeniable pull of the Christmas spirit he had long since abandoned. "I'm not sure," Richard started, eyeing the cup with suspicion. "It's on the house," she said, her voice light, almost teasing. "No strings attached, just a warm drink for the cold night." There was something disarming about her tone. It was so genuine, so unapologetically kind, that Richard felt an odd unease settle in his chest. He hadn't come here for charity, and he wasn't in the mood for conversation. But there was something about her that felt different, as if the world she inhabited was so far removed from his own that he couldn't help but engage. He accepted the cup, barely managing a nod of acknowledgement. As his fingers brushed against the paper, he noticed the smell of fresh coffee, bitter yet somehow inviting, a stark contrast to the sterilized, perfectly brewed lattes he drank in his office. "Thank you," Richard said curtly, trying to sound as disinterested as possible. He raised the cup to his lips but didn't take a sip, as though the mere act of accepting the gift made him feel like he was violating some unspoken rule. The woman chuckled softly, unfazed by his stiff demeanor. "You look like a man who doesn't believe in Christmas." Her tone wasn't judgmental, just a quiet observation. Richard stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He hadn't realized that his indifference to the holiday was so apparent. He almost felt defensive, but couldn't quite find the words to explain. Instead, he simply shrugged. "Christmas is overhyped," he muttered. "It's just another excuse for people to stop working and act like they care about things they don't really understand." The woman's eyes twinkled, as if amused by his bluntness. "Maybe. But for some of us, it's the one time of year when the world feels a little warmer, a little kinder." Her words pierced through the walls he had so carefully built around himself. Richard didn't know why, but he felt a strange stirring in his chest, something close to discomfort. He wasn't used to people talking to him like this, so openly, so honestly, without pretension. He was used to being admired, worshipped even, for his wealth and status, not having a simple conversation with someone who had so little. "You don't seem like the type to care much for Christmas either," Richard said, his voice colder than he intended. "Seems like you've got your own problems." The woman tilted her head, unfazed. "I don't need much. Just a little warmth and the occasional good conversation. Maybe that's what Christmas is really about." Richard didn't respond. He felt oddly drawn to her easy confidence in the face of so much hardship. She seemed so comfortable in her own skin, so at peace with who she was, despite the rough conditions she faced. and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Well, Merry Christmas, whether you like it or not," she said with a playful grin as Richard started to turn away. Her words lingered in his mind long after he left the coffee stand, drifting through his thoughts like a quiet whisper. Merry Christmas, whether you like it or not. For the first time in a long while, he found himself thinking about Christmas in a way he hadn't before. What did it really mean? What was it about the holiday that so many people seemed to hold on to, even when they had nothing else? Richard tried to shake off the feeling as he walked toward his penthouse. It was absurd to let a brief encounter with a homeless woman bother him, especially at a time when he had so many other things to focus on. But as he walked through the bustling streets, he couldn't help but feel that there was something significant in that moment. Something that was missing from his life. Something he had long since forgotten how to recognize. The city was alive, the Christmas season in full swing, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a strange pull to the world he had spent so many years trying to shut out. The night was cool, the wind biting as Richard continued his walk back to his penthouse, but his thoughts were far from the brisk air or the city lights flickering around him. He couldn't shake the image of the woman at the coffee stand, the odd sincerity in her eyes. There was a calmness to her presence that made everything around him feel so much more frantic. He had never been the kind of man to pause and think twice about anything, least of all the offhand comments of a stranger. But something about her words, something about her smile, had planted a seed in his mind that refused to be uprooted. Maybe Christmas is about warmth, kindness, she had said. He scoffed at the thought. Christmas, warmth, kindness, those were just words, empty sentiments clung to by people who didn't know any better. In his world, kindness was a transaction. Warmth was a commodity. He gave generously to charity, sure. He wrote the checks, attended the galas, and made the grand speeches about progress and success. But it had nothing to do with heart. It was about image. Always image. And yet, as he neared his penthouse building, he found his feet slowing down. He was thinking about her, Grace. Her name, so simple, yet it echoed in his thoughts with surprising persistence. What was it about her? She wasn't glamorous, certainly not wealthy, and didn't belong to any world Richard recognized. Yet, there was something in her that had unsettled him. It wasn't just her words, but the way she seemed at peace with who she was. Despite the ragged clothes, the roughness in her voice, she didn't seem to care about the world's judgment. She wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't. Richard had lived his whole life pretending that wealth, power, control, these things were the keys to fulfillment. Yet the more he succeeded, the emptier he felt inside. No amount of money had filled the void. No accomplishment, no praise, no trophy from the endless series of meetings and deals had ever given him the satisfaction he craved. And now, in this moment, he was realizing something he had long ignored. There was something more, something beyond all of the things he'd built. He couldn't stop thinking about her. He didn't know why. He had no reason to. But it was there, at the back of his mind, an unshakable feeling that had been growing ever since he left the coffee stand. As he entered his penthouse, he dropped his briefcase on the polished floor and walked toward the bar. The alcohol cabinet gleamed under the soft lighting. A glass of whiskey, his usual coping mechanism, would have been the ideal way to relax. But tonight, even the thought of the amber liquid didn't hold the same appeal. Instead, he pulled out his phone, staring at it for a long moment. He could hear her voice again. Merry Christmas, whether you like it or not. Without thinking, Richard tapped out a message and hit send. Where can I find you? He typed. His finger hovered over the screen for a few moments longer before he added, I'd like to talk. The words felt strange to him, like they didn't belong in the polished world he inhabited. There was no corporate bravado, no guarded professionalism. Just a raw, unfiltered desire to understand the woman who had unknowingly caused him to question everything. Richard didn't expect an immediate reply. After all, it was late, and she had no reason to care about him. But within minutes, his phone buzzed. Her reply was short, simple. The coffee stand. Tomorrow. Richard stared at the message for a moment. The coffee stand? That small corner on a city street? Tomorrow? He didn't know why, but the thought of seeing her again felt like a necessary step. He needed to understand why he had let someone like her get under his skin. Why her words, so simple and unremarkable on the surface, had shaken him to the core. The next afternoon, Richard found himself walking back toward the same corner, the familiar scent of chestnuts once again teasing his senses as he approached the coffee stand. The place was just as he remembered. Small, humble, and surrounded by the buzz of the holiday season. People milled about, some stopping to buy snacks, others rushing to catch buses or taxis. But Richard's focus was singular. He was here for Grace. He stood for a moment, unsure of what to do, before he spotted her, just as she had been the night before, standing by the cart with her easy smile, her eyes alight with warmth. Despite her ragged appearance, she radiated a kind of inner peace that seemed to shine through the clutter of the world around her. She saw him too, and for a moment they simply locked eyes, as if acknowledging the unspoken tension between them. "Back again?" she asked, a teasing grin crossing her face. There was no judgment in her tone, no surprise, just the simple acknowledgement of their last encounter. I didn't expect to see you again," Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. The words felt foreign to him. He wasn't used to speaking with such openness. She shrugged, as if it didn't matter either way. "I don't have anything else to do," she said with a soft chuckle, her gaze shifting to the crowd passing by. "What's your excuse?" Richard hesitated before replying. "I wanted to talk. About Christmas. About what you said last night." Her eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Oh, you want to talk about Christmas with me?" She leaned forward slightly, folding her arms across her chest. "What's got you thinking about it all of a sudden?" Richard felt the words spill from him before he could stop them. "I don't know. I don't understand it. I don't understand you. People like you. You're different. You're so comfortable, so sure of yourself, even with nothing. And I've spent my whole life building something to feel safe. But I'm not sure it's enough anymore." She watched him intently as he spoke, her expression unreadable, though her eyes softened with something he couldn't quite place. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You're right," she said. "I don't have much, and I'm not comfortable with the world you live in. But I'm comfortable with me. And sometimes that's the most important thing of all." Richard stood frozen, her words sinking into him like stones dropped into a lake. He had built his empire on control, on power, on securing the external markers of success. But she, with so little, seemed to possess something far more elusive, far more valuable. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own emptiness. "I don't know if I can ever understand that," Richard said quietly. "But maybe I want to try." Grace smiled gently. "Maybe you should." The conversation with Grace left Richard with a sense of unease he couldn't shake. It had started as a simple, almost accidental encounter, but now it felt like something more. Her words echoed in his mind, challenging everything he had ever known, everything he had ever worked for. How had someone so far removed from his world, someone with so little, made him feel so unsettled? She had given him a glimpse of something he didn't know he was missing. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. He had always prided himself on being in control, of knowing exactly what he wanted and how to get it. But the questions she had planted in his mind, about Christmas, about his life, about what really mattered, were seeds that had begun to grow. The more he thought about them, the more he realized how shallow his world had become, how distant he had grown from the very things that might bring him peace. Richard didn't know why he had done it, but the moment he got back to his office the next day, he found himself making a decision that felt like it could change everything. Maybe it was the need to prove to himself that he could still take control of a situation, to act before his doubts consumed him. Or maybe it was just the desire to see Grace again, to understand what made her so different. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Lena, cancel all my meetings for the next 2 days," he said, his voice steady despite the excitement brewing within him. "And arrange for a car to take me to the Delacroix Estate's Christmas party tomorrow evening." Lena, ever efficient, didn't ask questions. "Understood, Mr. Westbrook. I'll handle it right away." He hung up and sat back in his chair, staring out of the window at the bustling city below. The holiday decorations, the lights, the warmth, It all felt so far removed from the cold, calculated world he inhabited. But something was calling him, something in the back of his mind whispering that it was time to step into a different world, one where control wasn't everything, one where real connections, however fleeting, could make a difference. And then, as though on impulse, he picked up his phone again. He typed out a short message to Grace. "I'm going to a high society Christmas party tomorrow evening. I'd like you to come with me. I'll pay you $10,000 for your time. No strings attached, just as my guest. If you're interested, let me know." He stared at the screen for a long moment, the words feeling strangely foreign. Was it absurd? Yes. Was it manipulative? Perhaps. But something inside him told him it was worth the risk. There was a part of him that needed to understand her, to see what it was about her that had shaken him to his core. And there was another part, a more selfish part, that just wanted to see if he could pull it off. To take someone like Grace, someone so different from his world, and bring her into his. He pressed send, and then immediately regretted it. The next morning, as Richard prepared for the party, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. It wasn't just the gala, or the extravagant displays of wealth that he was used to. It was Grace. The idea of her at the event seemed almost absurd. She wasn't his type. She didn't belong to the social circles he frequented. And yet, something told him she would fit into that world in a way that surprised him. He couldn't quite explain why. The night of the event arrived, and as Richard entered the grand ballroom of the Delacroix estate, the dazzling lights and the soft hum of music enveloped him. The gala was everything he had come to expect. Flawless. The guests were impeccably dressed, their conversations laced with business and subtle power plays. The air was filled with the scent of expensive perfumes and the clink of champagne glasses. It was a world he knew all too well, a world that, for him, had become almost suffocating in its predictability. But tonight was different. He had invited someone who didn't belong here, someone who would stand out, not because of her wealth or status, but because of her authenticity. Richard couldn't help but wonder how she would navigate this sea of perfectly polished faces. As the evening wore on, Richard tried his best to focus on the usual business discussions, but his thoughts kept drifting toward the door, waiting for Grace to arrive. He felt a strange anticipation, as though he were about to witness something remarkable. And then she walked in. Grace entered the ballroom with a hesitant step, her gaze scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. She wore an elegant dress, but it wasn't anything flashy, just a simple black number that clung to her frame, paired with modest heels. She didn't look like the women Richard was used to seeing at these kinds of events. She wasn't polished or preened, but there was something undeniably captivating about her. It wasn't her appearance, though. No, it was the way she carried herself. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, a calmness that radiated even in this sea of wealth and opulence. Richard stood from his seat, watching her approach. She looked out of place, but in the best way possible. Her unpretentious air cut through the superficiality of the room like a breath of fresh air. As she neared him, their eyes met, and for a brief moment he saw that same playful spark in her expression that he had seen the night they first met. "Quite the crowd," Grace remarked, her voice unfiltered, just as it had been when they first spoke. Richard couldn't help but laugh. "You have no idea." He led her through the room, introducing her to his colleagues and acquaintances. Grace seemed unbothered by their stares, her blunt honesty cutting through the formality of the social interactions. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that was exactly what made her stand out. As the evening progressed, Grace became an unexpected hit. She wasn't trying to charm anyone, but her genuine curiosity about people, her lack of pretension, and her straightforwardness drew people in. She cracked jokes, asked insightful questions, and spoke with such refreshingly blunt sincerity that the most jaded guests couldn't help but warm to her. Even the most polished elites found themselves laughing at her wit and engaging with her in a way they rarely did with others. Richard watched from the sidelines, a sense of unease growing within him. He hadn't expected this. He had brought her here to prove something to himself, to see if she could be part of his world. But now, as he observed her effortlessly navigating the room, he realized something. She was already changing the dynamics of the party. She didn't need to fit in. She didn't need the approval of anyone in the room. And for the first time, Richard wondered if that wasn't the true key to success in life. As the music played softly in the background, he found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the way the evening was unfolding. He had thought he was in control. But now he wasn't so sure. Grace wasn't trying to fit into his world. She had simply shown up and made it her own. The night was in full swing. The chandeliers overhead flickered in a soft, golden glow, casting a dazzling reflection over the guests' polished faces. The room was filled with the sweet clinking of glasses and hushed murmurs of well-practiced conversations. Everyone was on their best behavior, wearing the kind of smiles that seemed to be meticulously engineered for just such an occasion. It was a world Richard Westbrook knew all too well, one that had become as familiar as his own reflection. The people here, the champagne, the grandiosity of the estate, it was all just another night, another business opportunity veiled in the glittering pretense of holiday cheer. But there was something different about tonight. It wasn't the ostentatious wealth on display, or the political and financial deals that took place behind closed doors. It was the quiet presence of Grace, standing beside him like a breath of fresh air in a suffocating room. She looked slightly out of place, her mismatched yet elegantly simple outfit in stark contrast to the perfect tailored suits and glittering gowns around her. And yet, despite being so clearly apart from the world she now inhabited, she had a way of drawing attention without even trying. Richard watched as she moved through the crowd. She wasn't like the women he was used to seeing at these events. Grace had no pretension about her, no need to appear perfect, and that was exactly what made her stand out. She didn't try to impress anyone, and yet she seemed to be making a lasting impression on everyone she encountered. Her laugh was genuine, loud, and unfiltered, breaking through the more subdued tones of the others around her. Her candid questions, her no-nonsense way of speaking, made the polished crowd come to life, even if only for a few brief moments. He wasn't the only one noticing her. Richard had seen it when she first arrived, the way people hesitated, glancing over at her, unsure of what to make of this unexpected guest. But soon enough, she had charmed them, disarmed them with her openness. Grace wasn't trying to win anyone over, and that was exactly why they found themselves drawn to her. In a room full of carefully cultivated personas, she was a stark contrast. She was real, raw, and undeniably genuine. And people, Richard realized, craved that. Even the most hardened of his colleagues had softened in her presence. It was unsettling, in a way. He couldn't deny it. Watching her, seeing the way she interacted with the crowd, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Something close to admiration, maybe even awe. Richard had built his empire by being ruthless, by being in control of every situation. And yet, here was Grace, a woman with nothing but her wit and authenticity, taking over the room without even trying. Despite his growing discomfort, Richard couldn't look away. He had thought he was the one bringing her into this world, giving her a glimpse of his life. But now, he realized, it was the other way around. Grace wasn't just a guest at this party, she was slowly starting to own it. As the evening wore on, Richard found himself struggling to engage with the usual business conversations. He couldn't stop thinking about her. It was as though she had shifted something within him, something he didn't even know needed shifting. There was a moment when he caught sight of Grace laughing with a group of high-powered individuals, their stiff upper lips broken by her candid humor. She was holding court without even trying. And yet, Richard couldn't help but feel a flicker of jealousy. Not jealousy in the way he might have expected. It wasn't about her stealing the attention he thought he should have had. No, this was different. It was the kind of jealousy that made him question everything he had ever known, everything he had ever worked for. How had she become the center of attention so effortlessly, so naturally? Was it because of her charm, her ability to disarm everyone around her? Or was it because of something deeper, something that Richard had lost touch with long ago? He had everything, money, power, status. And yet, in this moment, he felt as though he were the one who didn't belong. Grace had somehow cracked open the polished veneer of his world, exposing something raw and uncomfortable beneath it. And as he stood on the sidelines, watching her engage with his peers in a way that he never could, he wondered, was it possible that she had something he needed? Later in the evening, as the music softened and the crowd began to thin out, Richard found himself by the bar, nursing a glass of scotch. He hadn't seen Grace for a while, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was somewhere, mingling with the guests, drawing them in with her unfiltered honesty. He scanned the room, but there was no sign of her. Just as he was about to turn away, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned, and there she was, standing with a glass of champagne in hand, her smile wide and genuine. "There you are," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "I've been talking to your friends. They're all so fascinating." Richard couldn't help but laugh. "Fascinating, huh?" "Of course. They all talk about power, influence, and money, but none of them seem to really know anything. It's all just smoke and mirrors. I prefer real conversation. You should try it sometime," she teased, her voice light but pointed. Richard swallowed his scotch, feeling the burn of the alcohol, but also something else, something he wasn't sure he wanted to admit. "I suppose you're right. Sometimes I think I've lost touch with what really matters." Grace raised an eyebrow, her expression softening just slightly. "What do you think really matters, Richard?" He hesitated. The question hit him harder than he expected. He was used to making decisions based on what made the most money, what would bring the most success. But when it came to this, when it came to Grace and her honest, unvarnished perspective, he wasn't sure what to say. He had built his empire on rules and strategies, but now, in her presence, it all felt so hollow. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. "I've spent so long chasing one thing that I'm not sure I even know what I'm supposed to be chasing anymore." Grace studied him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful, before she took a slow sip of her champagne. "Maybe you've been chasing the wrong thing." Richard was about to respond when the sound of the clock striking midnight filled the room. The party, which had seemed endless only moments before, was coming to an abrupt end. He looked around, realizing that many of the guests had already begun to make their way to the exits, their faces showing the faint traces of boredom that had been masked by the alcohol and pretension of the evening. And then, as though the party itself had taken on a new meaning, Grace stood up, brushing off her dress with an air of casual grace. "I'm going to go," she said softly. "Thank you for the invitation, Richard. It's been eye-opening." Richard nodded, his thoughts a blur. "I'll walk you out," he said, standing quickly. But as he turned to follow her, something caught his eye, something odd, something that seemed completely out of place. Grace was holding something, a small photograph clutched tightly in her hand, the edges worn and faded with time. She had noticed it too, and for a brief second, their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Without saying another word, Grace turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Richard behind with nothing but the heavy feeling of questions he had no answers to. As Grace disappeared into the crowd, Richard stood still for a moment, trying to process the strange shift in the evening's atmosphere. His mind raced, circling back to that moment when he had glimpsed the photograph she was clutching. He had seen the flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet intensity, a secret she hadn't yet shared. There was no question now that she wasn't just another fleeting guest at the party. Something about her, something about this evening, was different. Despite his unease, Richard couldn't help but feel a pull to her, a magnetic force he hadn't experienced in years. He had invited her here, true, but somewhere along the way, she had become the star of the evening. Grace was not simply fitting in with the sophisticated crowd. She was redefining the entire event. He watched as she weaved her way through the party, effortlessly making new connections with people he knew all too well. Richard had grown accustomed to the polished, sometimes empty conversations of his peers. But with Grace, there was none of that pretentious small talk. She asked questions that cut through the surface, probing people in ways that disarmed them, and her honesty was a breath of fresh air. She didn't care if someone was an influential politician or an artist trying to make a name for themselves. Her interest was purely in people, in who they were beneath the facade. At first, Richard had been annoyed by the attention she was getting, but now he found himself observing her with something akin to admiration. People laughed more when she spoke, listened more intently, and for the first time in a long while, Richard noticed the absence of that guarded, performative air that usually dominated these kinds of events. Everyone had let their guard down. Grace, without trying, had created an environment where people were actually engaging. No one was pretending, not even the people who had built their lives on pretense. Who knew the grumpy CEO would have such an interesting guest? He heard a colleague murmur as they passed by, and it made Richard's stomach twist. Grace was a breath of air that cut through the thick walls of his high society world, and the longer she stayed in it, the more he realized just how suffocating his life had become. He had made a career of controlling everything, of knowing exactly how to navigate any room, any conversation. But Grace? She was unpredictable, unafraid to speak her mind, and completely free. It was as though the air around her had shifted, and now everyone was compelled to pay attention. By the time the evening reached its peak, Grace had become the star of the gala. She was on the dance floor, twirling around with a group of guests, her laughter ringing out above the music. Richard, standing on the sidelines, watched her, the contrast between her effortless confidence and his own increasingly restless state becoming more apparent by the minute. His grip tightened around the glass of scotch in his hand as he saw Grace spin, her smile wide, her energy completely uninhibited. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to fit in so well, to outshine even the most sophisticated socialites in the room. It wasn't just her appearance, though she was striking, certainly. It was her presence. Grace was bold, free, and completely unapologetic in a way that made everyone around her feel alive. Richard couldn't understand it. How had she come here with nothing and yet managed to take over this world so completely? Richard, someone said, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Jennifer Cole, one of his more astute colleagues. She had been watching Grace with curiosity ever since the moment she'd walked in. Your guest certainly seems to be making quite the impact. Richard glanced over at Jennifer, her voice tinged with a mixture of amusement and something darker, perhaps envy. She's different, Richard said, trying to brush it off. A little unorthodox, but she's fine. Jennifer raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of her drink. Different? She repeated. No one's ever made a mark like that here without the proper connections or pedigree. She's not even from the right background. But somehow, she's captured everyone's attention. You've got yourself quite the enigma, Richard. Richard didn't respond, but something in Jennifer's tone irked him. He had never been particularly fond of her, always sensing a competitive streak beneath her perfectly composed exterior. But this time, he couldn't ignore the truth of her words. Grace had something Jennifer, and so many of his other friends, didn't. She had something he couldn't define, but something he felt deep within himself. She was more than just a charity case. She was a force of nature. The music changed to something slower, and Richard, unable to resist any longer, found himself moving toward the dance floor. He watched Grace for a moment, captivated by the effortless way she interacted with people. She wasn't just laughing with them. She was making them feel seen, heard, and valued in ways that no one else could. The night was almost over, but she still had the room wrapped around her finger. He had invited her here, thinking she would be a distraction, a temporary solution to ease the burden of his lonely existence. But now, as he made his way toward her, he realized that she was far from a distraction. Grace wasn't a woman to be simply understood. She was someone who had the power to change everything she touched. When he finally reached her, Grace was laughing with a small group near the edge of the dance floor. She turned toward him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was something in her gaze that was soft but also knowing, as though she could see right through him. "Having fun?" she asked, her voice light. "I should be asking you that," Richard replied, his lips curling into a half-smile. "You've certainly taken over the party." She grinned back at him, unfazed. "I just called it like I see it," she said, shrugging. "And I see a lot of people here pretending to be something they're not." Richard's smile faded slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he watched her as she leaned back against the bar, her expression shifting slightly. She was so incredibly open, so incredibly real, that it made him question everything he had built his life upon. How had he lived for so long with so many walls around him, so many layers of protection, and not even realized how empty it had all become? Grace was different. She had been right all along. The people in this room, people like him, they had lost something. They had built their lives on foundations of wealth and success, but at what cost? Before he could respond, Grace stood up, excusing herself from the conversation and heading toward the exit. Richard, caught in a sudden wave of urgency, turned to follow her. He knew this was it, the moment when everything he thought he knew was about to change. As he reached the doorway, however, something caught his eye, something that sent a cold shiver through his body. Grace's gaze, flicking down to something in her hand. She was holding the photograph again. That same photograph. Without a word, she slipped it into her pocket and exited the room, leaving Richard standing there, consumed by a sudden, overwhelming desire to know what it all meant. The night seemed to drag on longer than usual, the faint echoes of music and clinking glasses fading into a distant hum as Richard found himself alone with his thoughts. The weight of the evening's events pressed on him, and though the grand ballroom remained alive with the laughter and chatter of his elite circle, his focus was entirely on Grace. Where had she gone? Why had she slipped away so suddenly, without a word? He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something deeper was happening here. Something more than just an impulsive arrangement to bring a homeless woman to a high society event. Richard found himself standing at the bar, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand as he scanned the room once more. His gaze swept over the guests who had spent the evening trying to impress him, all dressed in tailored suits and glimmering gowns. He was surrounded by success, wealth, and influence, but for the first time, he couldn't care less about any of it. Grace had shattered something inside him. It was as if she had stripped away all the layers of pretense that had built his world, leaving him exposed to a truth he hadn't wanted to confront. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to find Grace. When he finally spotted her again, she was sitting by herself at the edge of the room, her back against the velvet-covered wall, sipping a glass of champagne with an air of quiet contemplation. Richard hesitated for only a moment before he made his way toward her. His heart was racing, though he couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't fear. No, this was something else, something deeper. As he approached, Grace looked up from her glass, her eyes locking onto his. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her gaze that told him she had been waiting for him. She didn't stand, didn't offer him a smile, just continued to watch him with that piercing, knowing look. "Having a good time?" she asked, her voice low but tinged with amusement. Richard couldn't hide the frustration that bubbled up inside him. "Why did you leave like that?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "You just disappeared, Grace, without a word." She didn't seem startled by his sudden directness. Instead, she took another sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving his. "People come and go at these things, Richard," she replied, her voice light. "And so do I. It's just how it is. I didn't think you'd miss me." The flippant response stung more than he wanted to admit. He hadn't expected her to care much about his presence, but hearing her say it out loud, without an ounce of sentimentality, struck a nerve. He had lived in a world where appearances were everything, where people were measured by their usefulness or status. But Grace was different. Her honesty, her refusal to play the game, made everything feel so fake. "No," Richard said quietly, "I didn't miss you in the way you're probably thinking, but I was wondering why you didn't say goodbye. You just slipped away." Grace tilted her head slightly, studying him with that unblinking gaze. "I didn't think you'd care enough to notice," she said, her tone softening ever so slightly. Richard swallowed hard, suddenly feeling the weight of her words. There it was again, the distance between them. It wasn't just about their social standings or their worlds. It was the fact that he had spent so much of his life believing that control, that keeping everything at arm's length was the key to happiness. And Grace, this woman who had nothing, had exposed how wrong he had been. "You're wrong," Richard said, his voice low. "I noticed. I've been noticing all night. You're not what I thought you'd be." Grace raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "And what did you think I would be, Richard?" she asked, her words soft, but the challenge clear in her eyes. Richard hesitated. The truth hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniably present. He had expected her to be a novelty, a distraction from the cold reality of his life. A woman he could use to break up the monotony of his own existence. He hadn't expected her to challenge him, to make him question everything about the life he had built. "I thought you were just a way to kill time," he admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Something to make the evening more interesting. But now, I see there's more to you than that. A lot more." For a moment, Grace didn't say anything. She just studied him, as if trying to decipher the truth behind his confession. Then she leaned back against the wall, her expression becoming more contemplative. "I didn't come here to impress you, Richard. I didn't even come here to make an impression at all. I came because you offered me money, and I took it. Simple as that." Richard flinched at the bluntness of her words. "You think I'm just another rich man throwing around cash to make himself feel better?" he asked, his voice laced with a touch of defensiveness. "No," Grace said, her voice softening. "I don't think you're a bad person, Richard. But you're not living. Not really. You're just going through the motions, pretending like the only thing that matters is what's in front of you. But there's more to life than that. There's more to you than that." Her words pierced him, and for the first time in his life, Richard felt vulnerable. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He had built his empire, his wealth, his reputation around being untouchable, unreachable. And now, here was Grace, someone who had nothing, stripping away everything he had worked so hard to protect. He wanted to push back, to defend himself, but something in the sincerity of her voice stopped him. Instead, he took a long drink from his glass, trying to calm the storm inside him. When he set it down, his hands were shaking slightly, and his heart was beating faster than usual. "You're right," he said, the words coming out more quietly than he intended. "I've been so focused on control, on keeping everything in order, that I've forgotten what it feels like to be alive, to truly live." Grace smiled softly, her eyes glinting with a mixture of understanding and compassion. "It's never too late to start, Richard, but you've got to let go of all that." She paused, gesturing to the glittering party around them. "All that stuff that doesn't really matter. You've got to find out what really matters to you." Richard stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling into his chest. He had spent his life building a fortress around himself, convinced that the walls he had created would keep him safe. But now, standing here, he felt more exposed than ever. And for the first time in years, he didn't mind. Before either of them could speak again, there was a soft clearing of a throat behind them. Richard turned to see a familiar figure, a member of his staff, looking apologetic. "Mr. Westbrook, your car is ready," the staff member said. Richard nodded absently, then turned back to Grace. "I guess it's time to go," he said quietly. There was no urgency in his voice, just a strange sense of calm. Grace stood up slowly, her eyes meeting his one last time. "Good night, Richard," she said softly. "Take care of yourself." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Richard stood there for a moment longer, watching her leave, before he turned and followed the staff member toward the exit. But this time, it wasn't just another night in his perfectly controlled world. Something had changed. And for the first time, Richard felt like he was on the brink of something he hadn't known he needed. The night wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The drive back to his penthouse was eerily quiet. The city streets were lit up with festive decorations, but Richard hardly noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Grace. Her words, her laughter, the way she seemed to effortlessly challenge everything he believed in. As he gazed out the window, he couldn't help but replay the conversation they had by the bar. He had expected her to be just another temporary distraction, a person who would be out of his life as soon as the evening ended. But now, he wasn't so sure. Grace had made him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't experienced in years. For someone who had spent so long in the world of high society where everything was about control and appearances, her authenticity had struck him like a jolt of electricity. She didn't care about impressing anyone. She didn't care about his wealth or status. She didn't even care about Christmas. She cared about real, raw truth, the kind of truth that Richard had long since buried under layers of polished facades. As the car pulled up to his penthouse, Richard didn't feel the usual rush of satisfaction he got from coming home. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The penthouse was grand, the walls lined with priceless artwork, the floors gleaming marble, and yet it felt cold, lifeless. He hadn't noticed it before, but tonight, everything seemed sterile and uninspired. It was as if the space was built to impress others, not to live in. He stepped out of the car and into the elevator, his mind still swirling with the echoes of Grace's words. For someone who's got it all, you seem like you're missing something. The words repeated themselves in his mind, each time digging deeper into the truth behind them. Grace had been right. Despite all the wealth, the power, the control, something had always been missing in his life. He had spent so many years chasing success, climbing the corporate ladder, and filling his world with people who admired him for what he had accomplished. But none of it had ever brought him the fulfillment he thought it would. The emptiness he felt was not something that could be fixed with money, awards, or more possessions. It was something deeper, something personal. When he reached his penthouse, he didn't feel the usual sense of relief. He walked past the grandiose living room, the sleek kitchen, the designer furniture, and stopped in front of the large windows that overlooked the city below. He was high above it all, physically and metaphorically. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was on top of the world. He felt small. The words Grace had said about finding what really mattered echoed in his mind. He thought back to their conversation, to the way she had talked about her life without pretense. She had so little, yet she had something he longed for, a sense of connection, a kind of raw, unfiltered truth that was missing from his own life. Richard sank into a chair by the window, his thoughts swirling like the snowflakes outside. He had lived his life with purpose, yes. But had he ever truly lived? He had been so focused on controlling every aspect of his existence that he had missed the point. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about appearances. It was about feeling. It was about relationships. It was about allowing yourself to be vulnerable. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the business card he had given Grace earlier. As he stared at it, a thought struck him. Grace had told him that she had nothing to prove. But now, in this moment of clarity, Richard realized he had everything to prove. To himself. He had to find her again. He had to know more about her. Her blunt honesty, her unapologetic demeanor had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. It was as if she had handed him the key to something he had been searching for, even if he hadn't known it at the time. The problem, of course, was that Grace had made it clear she wasn't interested in a relationship based on his wealth or status. She had no agenda, no hidden motivations. But that only made him more determined to learn about her, to see if what she had to offer was something he could truly understand and embrace. Richard stood up abruptly, his decision made. He had no idea where to start searching for her, but he couldn't let it go. The night had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain, but it had also given him a spark of hope, a hope he hadn't known in years. It was as if, in meeting Grace, he had finally seen the cracks in his own carefully constructed world. And now, for the first time, he was ready to break free from the cage he had built for himself. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of the penthouse. The city was still alive with Christmas lights, the streets filled with people. The holiday cheer that he had once dismissed felt oddly comforting now. It was a reminder that there was still beauty and warmth in the world, despite everything he had tried to distance himself from. Richard had to find Grace. He spent the next few hours driving through the city, retracing his steps from earlier that evening. He went back to the coffee stand where he had first met her, but there was no sign of Grace. He checked a few of the nearby shelters, asking around if anyone had seen her, but the answer was always the same. No one had heard from her. Frustration gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important he was missing. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about finding her again. It was about something much deeper, something personal. He had been running away from it for so long, hiding behind his wealth and his power. But Grace had somehow cut through all of that, forcing him to confront the part of himself he had buried. The longer he searched, the more determined he became. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming need to find her, to understand her, to understand what she had shown him about his own life. As the hours passed, Richard found himself standing in front of a modest community center on the edge of town. The building wasn't much, just a small, unassuming structure, but something about it felt right. It was quiet, almost peaceful, and there was a warmth to it that seemed to call to him. He stepped inside, greeted by the scent of coffee and the soft murmur of conversation. There was a bulletin board near the entrance, filled with flyers for local events and volunteer opportunities. And then, in the far corner of the room, he saw her, Grace. She was sitting on a bench, her legs crossed, talking to a young boy who looked no older than 6. The boy was laughing, his eyes bright, and for a moment Richard froze. It was like the entire world had paused around him. Then, something caught his eye, a photograph that the boy was holding. It was a picture of a modest Christmas tree, and standing in front of it was a young boy, maybe 6 years old. Richard's heart skipped a beat as he recognized something in the child's eyes, a familiarity that sent a chill down his spine. Without thinking, Richard stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Grace?" he asked. Grace looked up at the sound of his voice, her expression shifting from the gentle smile she had been offering the child to a more guarded, cautious look. For a brief moment, the light in her eyes dimmed, and Richard felt a pang of guilt for intruding on this peaceful moment. But he couldn't turn back now. "Richard?" she said, her voice calm but with an edge of surprise. "What are you doing here?" Her question, though simple, seemed to carry a weight Richard hadn't anticipated. He paused, unsure how to explain the surge of emotions, the confusion, and the realization that had pushed him to this moment. I've been looking for you," he admitted, his voice more vulnerable than he intended. I need to understand." Grace stood up, her posture stiff as if bracing herself for something, but her eyes softened as she glanced down at the boy beside her. The child, sensing the tension, tugged gently on her sleeve. "Who's this, Mommy?" he asked, his innocent voice breaking the silence in the room. Richard's breath caught in his throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The photograph, the boy in the picture, it wasn't just anyone. This boy was his. A cold shiver ran down Richard's spine as the words finally clicked. His mind raced, scrambling to understand the magnitude of the situation. Could it be true? Could this little boy, with his bright eyes and messy brown hair, be his son? Grace's eyes flicked to Richard, as if she were silently bracing for his reaction. "His name is Liam," she said quietly, her voice laced with both love and sorrow. "And he's yours." Richard stood frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with her words. The weight of the moment bore down on him, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. All at once, everything he thought he knew about his life shifted. His wealth, his power, his carefully controlled existence, it all felt insignificant in this moment. "Liam is my son?" Richard whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. Grace nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "He is. I've kept him a secret for years, Richard. I didn't know how to find you. I didn't know if you'd want to be a part of his life." Her voice faltered, the weight of her own pain surfacing. "I never wanted him to be a burden to you, but I've never been able to forget that night. And I couldn't keep him from knowing his father forever." Richard's heart clenched at the rawness of Grace's words. The years of silence, the isolation she had endured, and the heavy burden she had carried alone, it was all unfolding before him. A flood of guilt and regret surged through him, crashing over his every defense. "I didn't know," Richard muttered, the words barely audible, as if confessing a deep, aching truth. "I didn't know I had a son." The enormity of the moment hit him like a wave. The choices he had made, the life he had built, had all been a search for something that now felt so painfully irrelevant. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, focusing on acquisitions, deals, and success, but he had missed out on something far more important. Grace's face softened, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "I never meant to hurt you, Richard. I never asked for anything. I didn't want to drag you into this. But Liam deserves to know who you are. He deserves to have a father." Liam, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally looked up at Richard with a puzzled expression. "Are you my dad?" he asked, his voice full of innocent curiosity. Richard's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He knelt down to the boy's level, his gaze meeting Liam's wide, trusting eyes. The weight of the question hung in the air, and Richard struggled to find his voice. He had never imagined himself in this position, never imagined the life that had been quietly waiting for him all these years. But as he looked into Liam's eyes, something shifted inside him. The walls he had built around his heart began to crack. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this moment slip away. With a deep breath, Richard finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," he said softly. "I am your dad." The words, though simple, felt like a revelation. They felt like a promise, one he wasn't sure he was ready to keep, but one he would try his best to fulfill. Grace watched him closely, her face a mixture of hope and fear. She had waited so long for this moment, and she was cautiously allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Richard would step up. Richard reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on Liam's shoulder. The boy looked up at him, a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope in his eyes. "You've got a lot of growing to do, kid," Richard said with a faint smile, his voice softer now. "And so do I. But I'll be here for you. I'll be here for both of you." Liam grinned, a bright, wide smile that lit up his face. "You will?" he asked, as if needing confirmation that this wasn't just a dream. "I will," Richard repeated, the words settling in his heart like a seed of hope. Grace watched them, her gaze flickering between father and son. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, against all odds, their fractured family could heal. The moment felt surreal, but it was real. Richard wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. There was something about Liam's presence, something about Grace's quiet strength that made him believe in the possibility of something more. As the night wore on, Richard and Grace sat together with Liam, talking softly, getting to know each other again. The awkwardness between them was still there, but it was fading, replaced by a tentative hope for the future. For Richard, it felt like the beginning of something new. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how to be a father or what kind of man he would become, but he knew that for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone in his quest for something more. He had found what he had been missing all along. Not success, not power, but connection. And that, he realized, was something worth fighting for. As the night wore on, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The days that followed Richard's unexpected reunion with Grace and Liam passed in a haze, leaving him with more questions than answers. The initial shock of discovering he was a father and the raw emotions that came with it had left him feeling both overwhelmed and disconnected from the world he had known. Despite his efforts to drown out the unsettling thoughts with his usual work routine, he found his mind continually returning to that moment, the moment when Grace had finally revealed the truth. Liam was his son, but as much as he was trying to process this revelation, there was something gnawing at him. He couldn't understand why Grace had kept Liam a secret for all these years. Why had she never reached out to him? Why hadn't she told him sooner? Richard was no stranger to power and influence. He had spent years building his empire, carefully constructing a life where everything was within his control. But in that moment, as the image of Liam's innocent face haunted his mind, he realized how little control he had over the course of his own life. He thought about the way Grace had looked at him, almost as if waiting for something, waiting for him to take the first step. Yet she had been silent about so much of their past. The reasons behind her secrecy, the pain behind her words. Richard felt there was more to her story than she had let on. He knew it was time to confront her, to uncover the truth. That evening, after a full day of meetings, Richard found himself standing outside the modest community center where he had first learned of Liam's existence. It was far from the glittering, high-rise towers that dominated his world, but the place felt oddly significant now, tied to the most important revelation of his life. He had spent the past few hours retracing his steps, trying to recall every word, every detail from that night. The image of the photograph, tucked in his jacket pocket, burned in his mind. The community center was quiet, and as he stepped inside, he was greeted by the familiar smell of warm food and the soft murmur of voices. It wasn't the first time Richard had visited such places, but now everything seemed different. He had been to countless events filled with the elite, surrounded by wealth and power, but this was real. This was where the true pulse of the world lived, where families fought to stay together and survive, not just thrive. He approached the reception desk, his footsteps hesitant, his mind clouded with the uncertainty of what he was about to learn. A young woman sat behind the desk, her eyes lifting when he approached. She recognized him immediately. "Can I help you, Mr. Westbrook?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. "I'm looking for someone." "Grace," Richard said, his voice betraying a hint of impatience. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for. He didn't know whether Grace would be here or whether she had left after their brief encounter. But there was no turning back now. He had to understand. The receptionist glanced down at a clipboard before nodding. "She's here with a little boy. I'll let her know you're looking for her." Richard nodded, feeling his pulse quicken as she disappeared behind a door. He stood in the entryway, the hum of conversation all around him, but his attention was solely on the door. Time seemed to stretch, each second pulling him further into uncertainty. A few moments later, the receptionist reappeared, gesturing for Richard to follow her. She led him down a hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. When they reached a door at the end of the hall, she knocked gently before pushing it open. Grace was seated at a small table, her hands folded in front of her eyes distant as she gazed at Liam, who was coloring quietly beside her. The sight of them together was heart-wrenching. It felt like a scene he never expected to witness. Grace looked up at the sound of the door opening, her expression guarded, but there was something in her eyes, something that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. "Richard," she said softly, her voice filled with an emotion that he couldn't quite place. She looked at him, her gaze flickering to the boy at her side before returning to him. "You came." "I had to," Richard replied, his voice low, almost trembling. He didn't know how to say what was in his heart or how to ask the questions that had been haunting him. "I need to know everything, Grace. I need to understand why you kept him from me, why you didn't tell me the truth." Grace's face softened, and she motioned for Richard to sit across from her. He hesitated for only a moment before lowering himself into the chair. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words, but Richard couldn't bring himself to break it yet. He needed her to speak first. He needed her to share her side of the story, to give him the answers he had been desperately searching for. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Grace spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to keep Liam from you, Richard, but I didn't know how to find you. After that night," she trailed off, her eyes flickering with emotion. "I didn't know how you would react. I didn't know if you would want to be a part of his life." Richard's heart clenched. He knew she wasn't blaming him, but the weight of her words struck him harder than anything he had expected. She had been carrying this secret, this heavy burden, for so long. And now, it felt like he was only just beginning to understand the depth of her pain. "You didn't trust me?" Richard's voice was thick with emotion, the question hanging in the air between them. "No, it wasn't that." Grace replied quickly, shaking her head. "It's just, you were so focused on your career, on your success. I didn't want to disrupt that. I didn't want to put Liam through the uncertainty, and I didn't know if you'd even care. I thought I could do this on my own." Richard felt a deep pang of guilt at her words. She had thought he wouldn't care. He had been so consumed by his ambition, so wrapped up in the pursuit of wealth and status, that he had never considered the possibility of something more meaningful, a family. Now the truth hit him hard. He had never considered the consequences of his choices. He had been so focused on building an empire that he had neglected the most important thing of all, connection. "Why didn't you tell me about him sooner?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now, laced with an ache he couldn't hide. Grace looked down at Liam, who was still absorbed in his coloring, unaware of the tension in the room. "I tried," she whispered, "but I didn't know how to reach you. You were so unreachable, Richard. Your world was so different from mine. I thought maybe he was better off without you." Liam's small voice broke into the conversation. "Mommy, who's that?" he asked innocently, looking up at Richard with wide, curious eyes. Grace turned to smile at him gently, her voice soft. "That's your daddy, sweetheart," she said, her words carrying both tenderness and a hint of sadness. Liam tilted his head, confusion clouding his features. "My daddy?" Richard's heart clenched. It was clear Liam didn't fully understand what that meant yet. But as he watched Grace gently explain the concept to him, a quiet resolve began to settle within Richard. The distance between him and this child, the child who carried his blood, couldn't be bridged overnight. But he had to try. He owed it to Liam. He owed it to Grace. "Liam," Richard started, his throat tightening as he tried to find the right words. But before he could finish, Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent request for patience. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with the sound of Liam's crayon on paper, the faint rustling of pages as Grace continued to guide him through his task. Richard felt a weight lift off his chest, but it was replaced by something else, a determination to make things right. He wasn't sure how to begin or where to go from here, but he knew one thing. He couldn't walk away now. "I want to be part of his life, Grace," Richard finally said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he couldn't contain. "I want to be his father. I want to be here for both of you." Grace looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any trace of doubt, any hint that this was just another empty promise. But all she saw was sincerity. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have a future together. Richard reached out, his hand hovering over the table for a moment before he placed it gently on Liam's small, unsteady hand. The boy looked up at him again, and this time there was no confusion in his eyes. There was only hope. "Let's start from here," Richard said softly. "Let's start now." And as the night drew on, Richard realized that everything he had been searching for, his purpose, his connection, had been waiting for him all along, in the most unexpected of places. The days following Richard's decision to stay in Liam and Grace's lives were filled with moments of both joy and confusion as he tried to navigate this newfound responsibility. His world, once so rigid and controlled, was now beginning to feel less certain, less predictable. Yet, there was a part of him that could no longer ignore the stirring in his heart, a part of him that felt, for the first time in years, truly alive. Richard had spent the following days with Liam and Grace, trying to connect with the boy who now held a special place in his heart. He wasn't entirely sure how to approach being a father. He had spent so many years building his career, burying himself in work, that he had little experience with children. But Grace, always the steady one, had been patient with him. She guided him, step by step, in the way a mother would, with gentleness, but with a quiet determination that made Richard want to be better, to be the man they both deserved. But despite the tenderness in their newfound relationship, there was still a shadow that hung over them. Grace's quiet demeanor, the distance in her eyes whenever she looked at him, there was something she wasn't telling him. He had seen it in the way she held back when he asked about the past, the way her words sometimes faltered, as if she were afraid of revealing something deeper, darker, something that could change everything. And so, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she had let on. It was late one evening when the truth finally came crashing down on him. He had been spending time at the community center, trying to help Grace with some of the outreach programs she ran for local families, when he met a man named Lucas. Lucas was one of the volunteers at the center, a rugged, friendly man in his early 30s, with an easy smile and a quiet, unassuming nature. Richard had noticed him a few times before, but it wasn't until tonight that their paths finally crossed. Lucas had greeted him warmly, offering him a handshake as they made small talk. As they spoke, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was something familiar about the man, something in his eyes that struck a chord. But it wasn't until they were seated together that the truth began to unravel. "You must be Richard Westbrook, right?" Lucas asked, his voice casual but with a note of recognition. Richard nodded, trying to place him. "Yeah, that's me," Richard replied. "I've been helping out with some of the programs here. I'm just trying to do my part." Lucas smiled, but there was a shadow behind his eyes that Richard couldn't ignore. "I've heard about you, Mr. Westbrook. You've made quite a name for yourself. I've been working here for a while now, volunteering when I can. There was a pause, as if Lucas was deciding whether to say more. Richard could feel the weight of the moment, but he wasn't sure why. Lucas seemed like a straightforward guy. Why did Richard feel so uneasy? Is something wrong? Richard asked, trying to mask his concern. You seem like you want to say something. Lucas looked away for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Then, in a voice so quiet, Richard had to lean in to hear it, Lucas spoke. Grace never told you, did she? Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. Told me what? Lucas sighed deeply, the weight of the words he was about to say pressing down on him. She never told you about the time before, when things were different, about how she got here, about how she ended up on her own with Liam. Richard felt his heart race, the words sinking in like stones. I don't understand, he murmured. What do you mean? Lucas leaned forward, his voice low, the words coming out slowly, as if he were treading carefully. Grace wasn't always like she is now. She wasn't always this quiet, this reserved. She had a life, Richard, a life before she came here. And a lot of it, well, it's tied to you, to your past. Richard's chest tightened as his mind started to race. What was Lucas saying? What did he mean by tied to you? I don't know how much Grace has told you about her past, Lucas continued, but she was involved with someone before Liam's father, someone who used to be close to you. Richard's thoughts immediately jumped to a dozen different possibilities. Who could this person be? He couldn't think of anyone from his past who had any connection to Grace. She had been so mysterious, so distant about her life before Liam. He had always assumed she had simply kept things from him out of fear of rejection, of being judged. But this was something different. I don't understand, Richard said, his voice tight, the unease in his stomach turning to something darker. Who are you talking about? Lucas paused, then looked Richard straight in the eye. I'm talking about her ex, Riley Marks. The name hit Richard like a punch to the gut, Riley Marks. He hadn't thought about him in years. Riley had been a name from Richard's past, a name that, until now, he had buried deep in his memory. Riley had been someone Richard trusted, someone who had worked under him at one point. But that trust had been shattered when Riley had been caught embezzling from the company. A betrayal that had almost cost Richard everything. Riley's downfall had been swift and brutal, but what Lucas was saying, it made Richard's blood run cold. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in a way that made his heart race with dread. Wait a second, Richard said, his voice trembling now. You're saying Grace was with Riley? Lucas nodded, his face solemn. Yeah, she was with him for a long time. They were even planning a future together until Riley's betrayal came to light. And when he left, Grace was left alone, pregnant with Liam. Richard felt the room spin around him. This couldn't be real. The woman he had just met, Grace, had been with someone from his past? And more than that, she had carried his child without him even knowing? The thought of it filled him with a mix of guilt, anger, and confusion. I had no idea, Richard whispered, his mind reeling. Why didn't she tell me? Grace didn't want to burden you with it, Lucas replied softly. She knew how things had ended with Riley. She didn't want to drag you into the mess of her past, so she kept it all a secret. Richard's world seemed to crash down around him. The man he had trusted, the man who had betrayed him, had left behind a legacy, one that had followed him all the way to this moment. Liam wasn't just a child that Grace had kept hidden from him. He was the product of a life that Richard had long since tried to forget. But as the truth sunk in, something else became clear to Richard. The child before him, the boy who called him Dad, was not responsible for his parents' mistakes. He was innocent. And in that moment, Richard made a promise to himself. He would not let the past control their future. Thank you for telling me, Lucas, Richard said, his voice steady now, even as his mind struggled to process the flood of emotions. I need to speak with Grace. I need to understand more. Lucas nodded, as though he had expected this. Take your time, Richard. Just remember that the past doesn't have to define your future. You've got a chance to make things right. With those words echoing in his mind, Richard stood up, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. He had so much to figure out, about Grace, about Riley, and most importantly, about himself. But as he walked out of the community center, a new sense of determination took hold. He wasn't going to run from the truth. He was going to face it, head on, and build a future, no matter how difficult it might be. And that future, Richard realized, started now. Richard stood outside the community center, the weight of the revelation still settling in his chest. Lucas's words echoed in his mind like a relentless storm, each syllable reshaping his understanding of everything he thought he knew. Grace's connection to Riley, the betrayal that had haunted his past, and the child he had unknowingly fathered, it all felt like a twisted knot, one that he wasn't sure how to untangle. But one thing was clear: he couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't pretend he hadn't learned the truth. He couldn't erase the boy from his life now. Liam wasn't just some child Grace had kept hidden from him. He was his son, and Richard was going to be there for him, no matter what. With determination settling into his bones, Richard turned toward the shelter. He had to find Grace, and he had to make things right. For her, for Liam, for himself. As he walked, the streets seemed quieter than usual, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Richard's thoughts whirled around him. He was going to face Grace and tell her everything. He was going to make her understand that despite the years of silence, despite everything that had happened, he was ready to be a father. He was ready to be there for her and Liam. And he wasn't going to let the past destroy their future. He pushed open the door of the shelter, stepping into the warmth of the small, bustling room. It was quiet inside, just a few volunteers tidying up after a long day of serving food and providing shelter to those in need. And there, sitting by the window, was Grace. Her back was to him, but he could see her unmistakable form, her shoulders hunched slightly, her hands resting in her lap, her face distant as though lost in thought. Richard's heart clenched. He had so many things to say to her. So many emotions tangled up inside him. Emotions he had never given voice to before. But in that moment, all of it seemed too overwhelming. His mind scrambled for the right words, the perfect way to fix everything that had gone wrong. But the words never came. Instead, all he could do was walk toward her, silently, until he was standing right in front of her. Grace looked up at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes immediately flicking to his face. There was a faint smile on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes, they were filled with uncertainty and something else, something deeper. She had known this moment was coming. She had known that Richard would eventually find out the truth. "Richard," she said softly, her voice hesitant, almost fearful. "You didn't have to come." "I had to," he replied quietly, his voice full of resolve. "I need to talk to you, Grace, about everything." Her gaze flickered to the floor, her fingers tightening in her lap. She wasn't looking at him, not fully, and Richard couldn't help but feel the chasm that had formed between them. It wasn't just the years of silence. It wasn't just the lies. It was the weight of everything they had both been carrying. "I know," she whispered. "You found out. About Riley. About Liam. I never wanted to burden you with that. I wanted to protect you. I didn't think you'd... You thought I'd walk away." Richard finished for her, his voice low, almost a murmur. He could see it now, the fear in her eyes, the fear that had kept her silent for so long. "But I won't. I won't walk away, Grace. Not from you. Not from Liam." She finally lifted her eyes to meet his, and in those eyes he saw a glimmer of hope, so faint, so fragile, but there nonetheless. Her lips trembled slightly as she spoke again. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling now. "I kept everything from you because I didn't want you to feel responsible for Liam. I didn't want you to feel trapped by what happened. It wasn't your fault. None of it was. I didn't want to ruin your life." Richard knelt in front of her, his heart breaking for her in that moment. "Grace," he said softly, "you didn't ruin anything. I'm not angry with you. I'm not angry with Liam. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, but the gesture was futile. Richard could see the walls she had built around herself, so thick, so high, but for the first time they were starting to crumble. The tenderness in his voice, the honesty, was reaching her in a way nothing else had. She let out a shaky breath. "I never thought you'd say that. I never thought you'd understand." "I don't understand everything," Richard admitted, his gaze soft. "But I'm going to. I want to. I want to be part of Liam's life, Grace. I don't care what happened in the past. We can't change that. But I'm here now, and I want to make it right. For him. For you. For a moment, there was only silence between them. The sound of distant voices, the rustle of papers, the murmur of volunteers coming and going, all of it faded into the background. It was just the two of them now, their hearts finally in sync after so many years of confusion and distance. Slowly, Grace stood, her eyes locked on his. Her body seemed tense, unsure, but something in her demeanor had softened. She reached for his hand, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Richard took it, feeling the warmth of her touch, feeling the pulse of connection between them that had always been there, even if they hadn't recognized it until now. "Richard," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "Do you really mean it? Do you really want to be a father to Liam?" "I do," he said without hesitation. "I want to be everything he needs. Everything you need." Tears began to fall from Grace's eyes, this time without shame. Richard pulled her into a gentle embrace, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and love. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew he had found his purpose. Not in the boardrooms or in the cold calculations of business, but in the warmth of this woman and the son he had never known he needed. For the first time in his life, Richard felt like he had truly come home. A father, a partner, a man who could finally embrace the messiness of life, the beauty of uncertainty, and the joy of starting anew. And as they pulled away from the embrace, Grace looked at him with a quiet, knowing smile. Liam, who had been watching from the corner, suddenly ran up to them. Richard knelt down, his heart racing with anticipation. "Dad?" Liam asked, his voice small but hopeful. "Are you really going to stay?" Richard nodded, his eyes shining with tears of his own. "Yes, Liam, I'm really going to stay." And in that moment, as father and son stood together, the future seemed wide open. There were challenges ahead, no doubt, but there was also love and hope and the promise of a new beginning. Richard finally understood. Life wasn't about perfection. It was about the people who loved you, the ones who needed you. And for the first time in his life, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Months passed since that cold winter night, and the world around Richard Westbrook seemed to have shifted in ways he could never have imagined. His life, once defined by cold ambition, by boardrooms and skyscrapers, was now full of unexpected joy. He spent more time with Liam and Grace than he had ever spent on anything else, and for the first time, he understood the true meaning of family. Richard had learned, slowly but surely, that life wasn't about control or perfection. It was about embracing the messiness, the imperfections, and the moments that you couldn't plan for. And there were so many moments. He was there for Liam's first soccer game, sitting in the bleachers with Grace beside him, laughing at the way the boy kicked the ball with wild abandon. He was there when Liam had his first big school performance, beaming with pride when his son took the stage. And he was there, every day, showing Grace that the man who had once been so distant, so wrapped up in his work, was now fully present for them both. As for Grace, she had become his anchor. She had taught him what it meant to love without condition, to be vulnerable without fear. Their bond deepened, not because they were perfect, but because they had learned to trust each other completely, to support each other through all of life's challenges. Grace, with her warmth and strength, had become the woman Richard never knew he needed. Their home, once cold and empty, was now filled with laughter, shared meals, and the sound of children's voices. And when the holidays came around again, the season that Richard had once dreaded, it didn't feel the same. The decorations, the lights, the music, everything felt different. They felt like a family, not just because of the traditions, but because of the love that had grown between them. On Christmas Eve, as Richard stood by the window, watching the snow gently fall over the city, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known. His office, once a symbol of everything he had strived for, now seemed distant and irrelevant. What mattered now was this moment, his son, his partner, and the life they were building together. "I'm glad I met you, Richard," Grace said softly, coming up behind him and slipping her arms around his waist. Richard turned to look at her, a smile spreading across his face. "Me too, Grace. Me too." And as they stood together, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Richard realized that the most important things in life were the ones you couldn't see coming. The people you met, the love you found, and the family you chose. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and times when they stumbled. But together, they could face it all. And for Richard, that was all that mattered. In the end, he had found something far more valuable than any business deal or successful investment. A second chance at happiness, a chance to be the father and the man he had always meant to be. The journey wasn't perfect, but it was his. And with Grace and Liam by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Thank you so much for following this story from start to finish. I hope it brought you special emotions and valuable lessons. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any exciting videos in the future. Feel free to share if you think this story could inspire someone in their life. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next story.